Today we're going to talk about cellular respiration and how it is involved in the breaking down of carbohydrates to produce ATP. Alright, so a brief overview of cellular respiration. This is a generalized equation of cellular respiration. So respiration is going to take in glucose along with oxygen, which makes this an aerobic process, and it's going to produce carbon dioxide and water, and it's going to release energy, about 686 kilocalories per mole of glucose consumed. Now, about 34% of this is going to actually be trapped in the form of ATP. The rest of it is lost as heat. And so this diagram down here is showing the difference or how that energy is going to be trapped as ATP. Believe it or not, that 34% is actually a pretty large number. And it does this because it oxidizes glucose or breaks it down through tiny, what you might also see, stepwise reactions, meaning it's going to release a little bit of energy in each one of these reactions, compared to one single reaction releasing all your energy, which is here on the right. So the idea is that this breakdown occurs in several small regulated steps, and that's what actually allows us to trap so much of that energy given off in the form of ATP. Recall that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and so this is actually where aerobic cellular respiration is going to occur. This diagram is pretty simplified in that it breaks down respiration into three main parts. You have glycolysis, which occurs in the cytoplasm, and then you have two cycles that occur within the mitochondria. You have the Krebs cycle, and then you also have your electron transport chain, which is very similar to the electron transport chain discussed in photosynthesis. Glycolysis is going to produce ATP. Krebs cycle will also produce ATP. So these two cycles alone are only going to produce a fairly small amount of energy. Where the real magic happens is in the electron transport chain. That's where most of the ATP we gain through aerobic respiration comes from, this electron transport chain. So let's talk about the first part of cellular respiration. This is going to be glycolysis, or the breaking down of glucose into a pyruvate molecule. So first things first is that you guys need to make sure that you can identify all of these different enzymes. I'm just kidding, not really. I don't even know all these enzymes. But there are a couple of things that I really want you guys to focus in on. And that's going to be how you start with glucose and you end with a pyruvate. And in between, we are actually going to be producing ATP. And so 2 ATP are given off in glycolysis through a process called substrate level phosphorylation. And so if you remember, the formation of ATP is when you take an ADP molecule and you attach a phosphate to it. In substrate level phosphorylation, that phosphate is actually taken off of this compound here. And so it's considered an organic phosphate because it came off of a molecule. This is different than oxidative phosphorylation, which is what we're going to talk about towards the end of this lecture. In addition, you may also notice that we are producing NADH. So that electron carrier, it's very similar to NADP or NADPH in photosynthesis. This part is the oxidation of pyruvate. So before that pyruvate can move into the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, pyruvate needs to become oxidized. And it does this through a series of steps in which we give off CO2. So this is the actual area where carbon dioxide is given off, the carbon dioxide you breathe out. And we're also going to be reducing this NAD plus to NADH. So it's picking up an electron to carry. And we're adding in what's called a coenzyme. And this specific coenzyme is coenzyme A. And so this coenzyme A comes into the pyruvate and it forms a molecule known as acetyl-CoA. We need this step because this is the reactant that's going to start the very next cycle. And so the key takeaway is pyruvate, we give off carbon dioxide, we pick up some electrons, and coenzyme A help produce acetyl-CoA. Again, now we're back at this citric acid cycle. And so you should be able to draw this out. Seriously. No, I'm just kidding. Again. Anyways, so that acetyl-CoA that was produced from the oxidation of pyruvate attaches to a molecule known as oxaloacetate. And acetyl-CoA attaches to that, and water is given off in this reaction. It goes through a series of changes, and we are going to produce a ton of NADH and a ton of FADH2. All NAD and FADR are electron carriers, so they're responsible for picking up those protons and carrying them through the electron transport chain. This cycle is important because this is actually where we get all those electron carriers to go through the very last cycle where all of our ATP is made. So now we're at the last step of respiration, the electron transport chain. So if you recall, the electron transport chain is a series of proteins. You don't need to be concerned with the names, but these proteins go through a series of redox reactions, meaning they're going to constantly pick up those electrons. And as those molecules are passed along, we are going to create energy. Now we're going to talk specifically about how this works. So we have our two electron carriers, some that were produced from glycolysis and some that were produced from the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, NADH and FADH2. They come into the electron transport chain and start giving off that electron. As they donate an electron, the hydrogen is pumped into this outer membrane space. And so at the very end, there is a gradient buildup, meaning that there's more hydrogen on the outside than there is the inside. And so what happens is that diffusion causes these hydrogen ions to move through this protein. This protein is called ATP synthase, which is an enzyme. And as these proteins come through this, they are going to turn ADP and an inorganic phosphate into ATP. This is oxidative phosphorylation, meaning that phosphate was inorganic or didn't come from another molecule. It was free-floating in the cell. Now, one thing that's important to recognize here as well is, why do you need oxygen? Well, as those electrons are being reduced, oxygen acts as the final electron acceptor, meaning that the very last hydrogen that's given off is going to attach to oxygen and produce water. So the only reason that we breathe in oxygen is to act as a final electron acceptor, meaning our very last NADH or FADH2 that's going through the system has somewhere to donate that hydrogen. And so it's going to bond with O2 to form H2O. So we're giving off water here, and we're producing a ton of ATP, about 34 ATP in total. So overall, the entire process of aerobic respiration is going to produce anywhere between 34 and 36 ATP. The electron transport chain can produce about 32 of those ATP. So we've just summarized all the steps of respiration. Make sure that you read section 6.2 in your book, and just focus on some of the topics that we discussed here.